During this first season of Counterpoint, one country has come up in almost every single debate. Take, for example, our conversation about South Africa.
If we neglect talking about China and the very
or our debate about whether Ukraine should negotiate with Russia.
You could say, well, Putin doesn't care about that. But meanwhile, he's formed a strategic alignment with China.
And even the question of attacking Iran's nuclear program.
If China is really our only peer competitor now, what would this do to our ability to deter China from invading Taiwan?
And today, for our final episode of the season, we're finally getting the chance to address the question of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, head on. Because over the past few weeks, tensions have flared again in the Taiwan Strait.
Taiwan's military forces are on high alert in response to what it says are the biggest drills by mainland China in years.
Taiwan's Coast Guard says 7 Chinese ships have been carrying out what it called grey zone harassment.
China claims democratic Taiwan as its own territory and has not ruled out the use of force to bring it under its control.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says his country would provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself should China attack.
We don't want to see any kind of unilateral change to the status quo in the Taiwan Strait.
Welcome to Counterpoint. Each week, we'll look at one pressing question facing world leaders from 2 opposing points of view. Today, we're going to debate the question, should the U.S. confront China more forcefully over Taiwan? I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky, a deputy editor at Foreign Policy and your host and moderator for the show. I'm joined by Jessica Chen Weiss, professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins and a former member of the U.S. State Department's policy planning staff. Welcome, Jessica.
Thanks for having me.
And by Markus Garlauskas, director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council and the former U.S. National Intelligence Officer for North Korea. Welcome, Markus.
Thanks so much.
Counterpoint is a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Let's get started. Jessica, I want to start with you. Do you think that the fear that China is about to invade Taiwan is overblown?
I do think it's overblown, and I think it's important to note that the commander of the forces in the Indo-Pacific has recently stated as such that there's, of course, the United States and Taiwan, of course, need to be prepared, whether that's today, tomorrow, or 5 years into the future. But I think there's little sign of an imminent attack or, a deadline for Xi Jinping to achieve his dreams of so-called reunification with Taiwan.
And when you observe military exercises like what we're seeing in the last few days, does that give you pause, or do you think that this is just a sort of routine gesture on the part of Beijing?
Well, it's not routine in the sense that it hasn't happened before to this extent, but I think the Chinese government has been looking over time for ways to signal their increasing displeasure with moves by, in this case, Taiwan's new president to visit and stop through parts of the United States and Guam and meet with or have phone calls with senior members of the U.S. Congress. Why I say this is distinct from preparations for, invasion, for example, is that there's no sign of the kind of mobilization for the wartime footing. This is not something that could be easily kept secret. And so what we are seeing here, I think, is further demonstration of China's displeasure. Again, not routine there, but they're finding ways to slightly move up the ladder of escalation, again, to, in their view, deter further moves toward what they see as a drift toward an upgrading of U.S. ties with Taiwan and Taiwan's permanent separation.
Markus, how do you view China's buildup in recent days?
So I agree with the basic premise that the PRC is unlikely to be preparing to launch major military action against Taiwan in the near term. However, I do fundamentally disagree that the primary purpose of these military exercises is just to signal displeasure. They are increasingly sophisticated and realistic demonstrations of the progress that the PRC is making toward being able to launch a major military action. And the problem is that each year that goes by, we're going to lose indicators as the PRC becomes better and better postured to be able to launch such an attack, and that we are going to be in a situation where we are increasingly desensitized by Chinese military activity. If it continues on this path, it's going to become more and more routine for China to have dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft constantly around Taiwan. And so this puts us in a situation where, as the years progress, China's capabilities improve. The United States and Taiwan and other potential allies and partners in the defense of Taiwan are going to be desensitized to this activity, putting the PRC in a much better position if it chooses in the years ahead to use military force to occupy Taiwan or to blockade Taiwan. Then we're going to be in a place where we're going to look back and say, oh, these exercises, they weren't just political signaling, they were actual real military preparation to make good on Xi Jinping's expectations and claims to be able to fully control Taiwan and his unwillingness to renounce the use of force to do so.
So in your view, does that mean the U.S. should increase its military presence right now in the region?
Yeah, so I think there's no question that as the PRC is changing the status quo by building up its capabilities to coerce and to attack Taiwan, that it is essentially strangling Taiwan, as Taiwanese officials told us when we were in Taipei just a few months ago, that the U.S. has to counterbalance that. If the idea is to maintain the status quo, it's the PRC that's trying to dramatically shift the status quo. And so the U.S. has to work to counterbalance that. Now, the U.S. can't and shouldn't do it alone. Taiwan has a very large role to play in this. And the United States should also be looking to other allies and partners to build up their own capabilities and demonstrate their will to stand up to Chinese efforts to coerce Taiwan and to potentially attack Taiwan. But to maintain deterrence and to maintain the so-called status quo, it is definitely necessary for the U.S. to respond decisively and rapidly, because right now the gap, I would say, is growing, where Chinese capabilities are advancing faster than those who would be postured to counter Chinese aggression.
Well, so I want to say that I don't disagree that we are losing kind of indicators and warnings as the action-reaction spiral across the strait has escalated. And that's one of the reasons why I disagree with the idea that the United States should more kind of forcefully confront China over Taiwan, because the problem is that many things that the United States, I think, has tried to do to show support for Taiwan typically provides then the occasion on which China ups its exercises and activities closer and closer to Taiwan. And we can't forget that it was Speaker Pelosi's visit that occasioned the largest now routinized crossings of the median line in the Taiwan Strait. And each of these, from the Chinese perspective, provocations has elicited and given them an opportunity, very much, as Markus said, to do these things on a regular basis, making it harder and harder for the United States and others to have advance warning. The question then is, what should we do about it? And I think that to some extent, I agree with the idea that part of increasing deterrence absolutely runs through helping Taiwan's military prepare, stockpile, and train. That is a piece of deterrence to deter and, if necessary, defeat an invasion or blockade. But deterrence doesn't only run through weapons and arsenals or planes in the air, ships at sea. There's actually a crucial part of deterrence that runs through assurance. And so when we talk about, is there some kind of decisive way in which the United States could respond militarily, I say the United States should, with Taiwan and others, respond, but not with the illusion that somehow China's just going to go home. This is only likely to kind of perpetuate a spiral that it really ends very poorly, either in conflict or something else. And so I think that it's imperative, as the Biden administration has done, to try to create some degree at very low level of stability, slowing, if not actually halting, that escalatory spiral.
But if confrontation aggravates things, how do you ensure that avoiding confrontation won't lead to capitulation?
Well, so that's why it's very important to draw the distinction between concessions, which do invite further aggression and the potential for capitulation, and assurances, which pair credible threats with the assurance that if the Chinese side exercises restraint, the United States and Taiwan won't just use that opportunity to push the envelope further. And so it's really that contingency of the military threat that's really crucial here. But it's very important then also not to create a window of opportunity by suggesting that Taiwan's not important to the United States or other things that various commentators and politicians have said, which I think do cast doubt on the strength of U.S. resolve to, as the United States has stated since the Taiwan Relations Act, take threats to Taiwan very seriously as a matter of grave concern to the United States.
Markus, what do you make of the sorts of assurances that Jessica is talking about? Do you think China and the Chinese Communist Party, also known as the CCP, will respond positively to that?
The idea that we could reassure the PRC to the point that it changes the fundamental trajectory that they're on, I think is misdiagnosing the problem. The problem is not a misunderstanding that Taiwan is going to move further away in some way from the PRC in a way that the U.S. is going to encourage or foster. It's that the natural progression of public opinion in Taiwan makes the idea of CCP control over Taiwan less and less realistic to be achieved peacefully. And so until and unless Xi Jinping and the CCP leadership back away from the idea that unification is necessary and that it will be potentially achieved with use of force, I don't think there's anything we can do to reassure Beijing to the point that will take us off the trajectory of a military confrontation. It may give them less pretext in the near term to conduct military exercises. It may reduce the potential for a miscalculation or a misunderstanding. But the fundamental problem is that as long as the people of Taiwan are not interested in being controlled by the CCP, and as long as the PRC is unwilling to accept that fact and is willing to use military force to resolve the issue in its favor, then anything we do to reassure the PRC could potentially just feed this perception that we could be willing to accept this outcome. And so there's a danger in reassuring the PRC too much. And the PRC, again, being unwilling to renounce the use of force to achieve its goals is going to mean there is going to be some degree of confrontation that has to be deterred.
But wouldn't a more aggressive posture from the U.S. right now spook China and provoke them? And couldn't preparing for a major war actually aggravate the risk and sort of turn it into a self-fulfilling prophecy, as Jessica was suggesting?
I think all we would do if we did not act to bolster our defenses and to bolster the visible will of the U.S. and its friends and allies to confront China if it decides to attack Taiwan. If we were not to do that, all that would do is further encourage the PRC to believe that ultimately it is going to be able to achieve its goals through use of force, or at least a threat of force. And so I think there's a extreme scenario on the other end where we unintentionally encourage, as you say, a level of confrontation at an intensity that's beyond what's necessary to achieve the goal of deterrence. But my experience to date and what I've seen is that we are far more hesitant to do things necessary to deter China, necessary to demonstrate will, necessary to maintain even the status quo, more so than that we're erring too far on the side of being unnecessarily provocative. I'm not saying that that's true in every case, but in general, we are far more hesitant because of this very scenario that you describe about provoking the PRC, when in point of fact, we should be worried much more about encouraging the PRC year on year to think that it's going to be able to achieve this goal militarily.
Jessica, China likes to set red lines for the U.S. What red lines do you think that the U.S. should set for China?
Well, I think it's been made clear, taking a step back from, the situation in the Taiwan Strait, that, China should not be interfering in American elections, right? Like that is a red line. This is, if you wanted to call it a core interest, right? Like that's inviolable. The Chinese don't draw red lines quite as clearly. There may be some discussion of them. But the problem with red lines is that they invite the target of those red lines to walk all the way right up to them and to feel like they can get away with everything short of crossing it. And then, of course, there's a problem of what do you do once you've set the red line and they tiptoe across it, and then what are the consequences? The Chinese government certainly has found value in trying to deter a far greater range of activity by making clear this is something they care a lot about, but not making totally specific, what exactly are the red lines. I mean, in this context, the United States has made very clear that it expects disputes across the Taiwan Strait to be resolved peacefully, and that emphasis on peace and stability rather than the ultimate outcome is still sort of the longstanding American position, and one that I think we rightfully uphold. The value of that is that it allows for the Chinese government to imagine that someday, far off into the future, long after the current leaderships maybe even have passed from the scene, that this could be resolved in a way that favors the Chinese position. I don't disagree with Markus that currently the positions are very much at odds with one another, but that's why it's all the more important not to put things to a head, that no solution is the best solution for the moment, and we just need to kick the can down the road. The challenge is, what are the things that could lead the leadership in Beijing to conclude that time has run out? That could be things that the United States suggests. It could be things that leaders in Taiwan suggest and are very sensitive to that appearance. So the trends, I think, are running in a couple of different directions. One, the relative balance of power. I think the Chinese government feels it to be on their side over time, and so that gives them some degree of confidence. But the changes in identity and on the island, of course, are quite negative. So I think that there is a real challenge here of sustaining that hypothetical into the future, but it's important then creating space for or at least holding out the possibility of a non-military solution. Because as you know, there's no military solution to this conflict, amphibious assault, blockade. This would all be completely, first of all, not only is it extraordinarily risky, it could risk backfiring and the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party's hold on power domestically. It would also absolutely tank the global economy and China's dreams of so-called rejuvenation. So this is not something I think they're going to reach for lightly, which is why I don't think that hope is lost for, the kinds of assurances paired with investments in deterrence, necessary to preserve the status quo until some hypothetical future solution can be achieved peacefully.
Markus, I'm curious about Taiwan's own military preparedness. How ready do you think Taiwan's military is? Could they actually fight a war now?
I think there's no question that they could fight. They're not as ready as they should be. And they're certainly not as ready as I think they will be in a few years. I see strong signs of their readiness for war militarily, and also the readiness of their society to stand up to Chinese aggression. But in the near term, if the PRC were to attack, yes, I have every reason to believe that not only the military of Taiwan would fight, but that there would certainly be a significant portion of the population of Taiwan that would support that fight and engage in it directly.
You're listening to Counterpoint. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky. We'll be right back. So I want to take a step back now and talk a bit about strategy and history and theory. Some Taiwan experts have been arguing recently that U.S. policy, especially the idea of strategic ambiguity, essentially keeping both Beijing and Taipei guessing about how far Washington would go to support Taiwan in the event of a war, that concept has outlived its usefulness, and that what the U.S. really needs right now is strategic clarity. Jessica, can you explain the concept of strategic ambiguity, and what do you make of calls to change that policy?
Absolutely. So, the U.S. policy has, for decades now, been predicated on the need to deter, of course, a military attack from Beijing, but also to dissuade leaders on Taiwan from pushing the envelope on independence. And so in the early 2000s, under President Chen Shui-bian, there were efforts to go to a referendum to change the constitution. And the United States, under the President George W. Bush, stepped in to say, the United States absolutely does not support Taiwan independence. And it's with that kind of history in mind that I think it remains important not to suggest that Taiwan has a blank check, that whatever they do, the United States will come there and be their military shield. That doesn't mean that the United States shouldn't also simultaneously prepare very much for a potential military contingency in which the PRC attacks across the strait. That's important for deterrence, to maintain a credible capability. But it remains the case that I think this, what is sometimes called strategic ambiguity, which is also, again, this dual deterrence, deterring the mainland from a military attack, deterring Taiwanese leaders from a political move that changes the status quo. That's been at the heart of U.S. policy, and it's been successful. The question of whether it should be changed, then, I think really kind of arises from the idea that, ambiguity doesn't sound right. The bigger threat is from the PRC. Certainly militarily, it's from the PRC. But nonetheless, I think it misses the fact that strategic clarity is more likely to potentially embolden those in Taiwan who don't feel that they want anything to do with China and would like to take steps to assert their independent identity and sovereignty. And that's very dangerous for the reasons that we've described. That it's not going to put Taiwan in a better position militarily, and it's more likely to provoke or elicit the kinds of military exercises and incursions that undermine Taiwan's security. It's not just military, of course, there's a whole economic campaign of coercion to isolate Taiwan and undermine its standing and its ability to resist. So, the benefits of changing U.S. declaratory policy are far outweighed by the costs.
We need to be clear that Taiwan is a democratic society. even if it is not recognized globally as a sovereign state. And we have to respect the fact that they, as a people, are going to make decisions, they're going to say things, and they're going to do things that reflect their own goals and interests. And so the idea that we could expect to deter Taiwan, I think that's not terribly realistic either. And it's not something that necessarily is about just affecting the calculus of the top leadership in Taiwan. Is if the goal is, as Jessica said, to kick the can down the road indefinitely in hopes that the PRC will just simply give up on controlling Taiwan, or maybe the CCP will go away and transform politically into something more tractable. If that's your intent, then unfortunately the people of Taiwan have a vote in that, or actually I would say fortunately for them. And so to the extent where you could prevent the president of Taiwan from declaring independence, that may be something that you can essentially deter. But deterring the people of Taiwan from being increasingly clear in their own minds and to others that they don't want to be ruled by the CCP, I don't think that's something that's realistic for us to deter. So the focus should be on deterring the PRC rather than expecting to be able to indefinitely deter the people of Taiwan from expressing their views about not wanting to be ruled by the CCP.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Has strategic ambiguity been a success in deterring China? And is it time for something different now?
Well, as far as it goes, success is as success does. And so we've managed to avoid a war between China and the United States. And so perhaps you could call it a success in that regard. I think in general, some degree of ambiguity is necessary when you are deterring an adversary. If you draw a red line in an exact spot and eliminate the ambiguity the adversary will face, that essentially cedes to them all of the territory below the red line. Conversely, if you draw a red line seeking to eliminate ambiguity, and then you are not fully committed to that red line over the course of years and changing administrations in office, then you can fundamentally undermine the credibility of the United States policies and warnings that it may make. That having been said, despite the fact that there is a need for some continued degree of ambiguity and some flexibility in terms of the options available for an American president to respond to various types of PRC aggression against Taiwan, in general, we are now, I would say, in the place where, in my assessment, we need to reduce the level of ambiguity in the context of a wide range of scenarios short of an all-out invasion, bolt from the blue type of situation where PRC, invades Taiwan, which, again, in the near term, as we've discussed, is not a particularly realistic scenario anyway. And so being able to provide some more clarity on the various types of actions that the PRC might consider taking short of all-out invasion, and the fact that the U.S. will respond to some of these things accordingly, I think would be helpful to deterring the PRC from its creeping efforts to strangle Taiwan and its gray zone tactics, as they're often called, and to recognize that even if the PRC does not launch a clear, invasion of Taiwan, that doesn't necessarily mean that the United States won't respond militarily. So I think we need to move sort of the baseline and provide a little bit more clarity on things other than the basic premise that the U.S. opposes military force to resolve the PRC's objectives vis-a-vis Taiwan. So we need to make some adjustments, but some degree of ambiguity, I think, is still appropriate and necessary.
Jessica, how much agency do the Taiwanese people have in all of this? You mentioned changing identity on the island. Tell us a bit more about that.
Very important. And I don't think that there's any denying that, Taiwan has earned through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears their thriving democracy. I think it's also important to note that the majority of people on Taiwan, according to surveys, prefer the status quo rather than a move toward independence, and that we should be careful about suggesting things that are not actually desired by the Taiwan people. That said, I think that the share of people who identify as Chinese, or both Chinese and Taiwanese, has declined. There's this sort of natural growth over generations of a de facto separate identity, which has made it harder to sustain some of the fictions, including the 1992 so-called 92 consensus, that have been, helpful in past administrations on Taiwan for stabilizing the situation. That said, there are, continue to be politicians in Taiwan that suggest different ways of reconciling the notion of kind of shared sovereignty while having still separate systems of political governance. I'm not sure those are going to go anywhere, but nonetheless, I think that there remains some degree of shared history and cultural affinity that at least some on the island still feel. Again, from the perspective of those sitting in Beijing, they can tell themselves a story where it's not inevitably moving toward a kind of military-only solution. I think they're still working toward retaining this emphasis on peaceful, so-called peaceful unification with military options as kind of a last resort. And I think our objective, even as we, I think, are in fact responding in many ways to China's growing coercion of Taiwan, supporting other fora in which Taiwan can have a voice internationally, short of organizations in which statehood is a requirement for membership. There are a lot of things the United States is currently doing and should continue to do. But other things, I think, particularly the idea that we would have surge forces to the region, I think might risk creating that very closing window opportunity that some fear.
Markus, I want to ask you about the regional landscape. You've written on this conflict and North Korea quite extensively. Do you think that there's a risk of conflict in Taiwan sparking a broader regional war involving the Korean Peninsula? And is that risk more acute now, given the recent chaotic events in South Korea?
So in short, yes and yes. So based on the analysis that we have done in my team and working with others under the umbrella of the Tiger Project on War and Deterrence that we are conducting at the Atlantic Council, the evidence is very clear that if a conflict sparked by a PRC effort to militarily control Taiwan were to extend beyond a short period of time, there are powerful drivers that would increase the risk that the conflict would escalate vertically in terms of intensity, but also would escalate horizontally, geographically across the region and across domains to include into cyberspace and potentially even to include attacks of various types on U.S. territory. And so I think the situation currently on the Korean Peninsula illustrates the fact that there are always variables in terms of the political situation in U.S. allied countries in the region that could lead the PRC to believe that a country will be more or less willing to support the United States to support Taiwan in the event of a confrontation. And so for me, one of the most important elements to being prepared to deter and, if necessary, defeat PRC aggression against Taiwan is to maximize our ability to work with allies and partners to demonstrate that if the PRC attacks Taiwan, it will not simply be a fight between the PRC and Taiwan or even a fight between the PRC and Taiwan backed by the United States, but that there will be other allies and partners. And again, it doesn't have to be a set list, but that there will be other allies and partners that will be engaged, and that also it will foster a regional strategic environment in which North Korea and Russia may also see the opportunity or the necessity for aggression in the region. So in the end, yes, I do think this is a very real and increasingly challenging factor because of the increasing capability of North Korea, its increasingly strong rhetoric. Although, to be fair, I guess the North Korean rhetoric can sometimes be hard to parse. But the sense that I'm getting is that North Korea is building up for some acts of military aggression. So therefore, with those variables changing and then with North Korea potentially benefiting tremendously from the support of Russia in exchange for what it's been providing to Russia's war against Ukraine, I think the risk of a conflict with the PRC becoming a simultaneous conflict with the PRC and North Korea and potentially with Russia has continued to increase.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you think it would necessarily happen in that direction? We've talked a lot about Chinese threats to Taiwan, encirclement of Taiwan, the exercises they're conducting. But is there a possibility that a war would start on the Korean Peninsula and spread to Taiwan and draw China and the United States in?
Certainly. And this is another part of our analysis. And we've done, a tabletop exercise on this very possibility. So it's not the idea that the PRC would necessarily attack Taiwan if North Korea attacks South Korea. Sort of this is their seizing their moment of opportunity, but it is the potential and the very high risk that if South Korea, the ROK, and the United States effectively counterattack North Korea after it conducts aggression against South Korea or others in the region to the point where it becomes a full-scale conflict, that counterattack that the U.S. and the ROK would launch would end up threatening the PRC's interests, because the PRC does not want to see, say, a collapsed North Korea being occupied by South Korean forces and U.S. forces and these sorts of things. And so the point is that the potential for the PRC to intervene, to at very least intercede in a way that's not particularly helpful to ROK and U.S. counteroffensive against North Korea, that's very real. And so in that context, if that leads to a U.S. PRC war, or the war between, actually, to be fair, between the PRC and the United States and then a whole number of allies and partners who are also interested in countering North Korean and PRC aggression, if that occurs, then I think it's very realistic that Taiwan could be one of several venues in which this larger U.S.-China conflict plays out. But I would be a little less concerned about the idea that, North Korea attacks South Korea and then therefore China attacks Taiwan. That's possible, but sort of a more organic escalation into a regional conflict, I think, is the scenario I'd be more worried about. And to be fair, I think a U.S.-China war may be more likely to start in the near term as a result of something on the Korean Peninsula than it is to start in the Taiwan Strait.
So I want to shift gears a bit now and look at how the incoming Trump administration might change the equation. During his last stint as president and during this year's campaign, the rhetoric has been quite heated and very tough on China. Jessica, I'm wondering, do you think rhetoric on other policy issues like access to semiconductors or hiking tariffs, do you think that feeds into escalation over Taiwan?
So I think that the more that the United States, under any administration, is seen as trying to contain, undercut, and even overthrow or subvert the Chinese Communist Party, that assurances that the United States is not trying to keep Taiwan away from China or use Taiwan against China as they fear, those assurances have less credibility. And so there is, I think, a relationship between the overall context in which the United States' relationship with China is evolving and the stability of ties across the Taiwan Strait. I will say, though, that on Taiwan, here's, I think, where there's been the greatest discrepancy between candidate Trump's rhetoric and that of many of the people he has appointed or nominated to serve in high-level positions in national security. Trump has famously described the resolute disc as this is China, and the tip of his marker is Sharpie as Taiwan, and has complained about how Taiwan stole semiconductors from the United States, and a whole kind of litany of complaints that, again, I think really call into question how much the United States would be there for Taiwan in the event of a potential conflict. That may all just be bluster and rhetoric and a way to get Taiwan to do more, which it is already signaling that they will do. But nonetheless, this is a pretty big departure in the other direction from where most U.S. presidents have been.
And you mentioned some of his appointees. Who are you talking about, and what do you mean in terms of the contrast between Trump and the people he's appointing?
Well, I think from the National Security Advisor to the Secretary of State to the Deputy National Security Advisor, on down, these are folks who have been, much more robust in their support for Taiwan, although they didn't go as far as former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo did in calling for the United States to extend diplomatic recognition to Taiwan. That said, pick for policy planning, Michael Anton wrote a piece in 21 where he said Taiwan is not a core interest of the United States, and we should think really hard before, fighting a war with China over that, given the current state of our military. Whether he still holds those beliefs in 2024, 25, I couldn't say, but I will say that there are some suggestions here being raised that aren't typically heard.
Markus, what's your sense of the incoming Trump administration and how they will act on the Taiwan issue? Do you think they are going to provide support for the policies you've been advocating?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I think the Trump administration is fairly early in its composition. And I think there are powerful reasons, as Jessica alluded, to expect potentially a stronger policy versus the PRC, including a stronger policy to support Taiwan. But there are also reasons to expect that the U.S.-Taiwan relationship may take a different path, and that the U.S. may, in some ways, become more sensitive to Xi Jinping's concerns about Taiwan. I think it's too early to tell. But the one thing I will say is there seems to be a broad consensus in Washington these days that the incoming administration will have a much wider, so to speak, Overton window of acceptable options to consider. And as a result, I would say the potential for Washington to embrace a stronger policy to support the defense of the Taiwan versus PRC aggression is a very real one, as is the possibility that we could see an approach that's much more conciliatory. I think the jury's out on that, and we'll see what happens.
Well, we have about 1 month or 5 weeks until the Trump administration arrives in Washington. I think we're going to have to close it there. Thank you both very much. My guests have been Jessica Chen Weiss, professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins and author of Powerful Patriots, Nationalist Protest in China's Foreign Relations, and Markus Garlauskas, director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council and an adjunct professor of security studies at Georgetown. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
That's it for this season of Counterpoint. We hope to be back soon with Season 2. Counterpoint is a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Our production staff includes Karen Given and Dan Efron, with special thanks to Claudia Tatey. If you're enjoying Counterpoint, please tell a friend. You can also leave a rating or review on your podcast app. It helps other listeners find our show. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky. Thanks for listening.